You know, one of the interesting things that we talk about all the time is around the speed at which we can rewire our brain for success. And, you know, a lot of people don't actually realize that we can do that in a really short period of time. So we hear a lot of things about how small changes can make a really big impact. Why is shifting your focus from problem to solution so powerful for the brain? Brad, what do you think?
Oh, look, it's one of the first things that we look at in any way of communicating, getting results. And it's understanding that through the process of our delete, distort, and generalize, if we limit ourselves and our thinking, we're just going to create more of what we don't want. So one of the most powerful processes is the concept of cause and effect, moving from the effect to the cause side of the equation, above and below the line thinking, depending on how you want to look at that. But that basically process of just actively being aware that you have created whatever you've created by your focus and taking ownership of that and moving that shift has a real huge momentum to being able to shift that thinking to taking responsibility for what you're doing, the results you have and what you want, therefore allows you to automatically start rewiring the information that you're getting through your reticular activating system, your RAS, and how that relates to your focus and how your results. So, Alex, in someone having one of those days and nothing's really going right for them, what's a quick NLP tool that can help them reset their mindset in just a couple of minutes?
Yeah, Brad, look, as we know that, you know, generally when we have one of those days, usually it goes from bad to getting worse, you know, and it's usually how we choose to perceive things. So when we perceive things as bad and we say, it's not a great day, I'm not having a good time right now, you know, that tends to creep up on you and will have an everlasting effect for the rest of your day. Yeah. So what we know is how we choose to perceive things affects, you know, how we actually perform and obviously affects us and our focus. So when you become mindful of the fact that you're starting to run that type of a pattern of behavior, it's always a great opportunity to hit a reset. And, you know, there's so many ways that you can do this, but once you become aware of it and you realize it, that's where you get to stop and decide and go, okay, I acknowledge my line of thinking is a little below the line. And, you know, what is it that I need to do in order to change that pattern of behavior or the way that I'm thinking and behaving and showing up at the moment. So it's about interrupting that pattern of behavior, and it's deciding from then and there that, you know, from here, I'm going to change. Today is about to change. Things are about to turn around. It's what you're focusing on. And of course, I've heard some pretty funny things that people have done over the last few years. And one of them is when someone likes to yell out plot twist. Yeah. So they've decided it's a plot twist change. So once again, this is called, you know, a pattern interrupt. And of course, the interruption becomes part of the pattern. So now we get to focus on particularly what it is that we want. And this, of course, opens up our thinking, creates a positive mindset, and changes the way that we start to filter the information moving forward. It changes the stories that we tell ourselves, and therefore it changes the picture in our minds. And of course, therefore, it changes our state and our behavior, also our language. So we go from being unresourceful into more of a resourceful state. And of course, this allows us to gain the ability to be thinking critically, allowing us to be success focused. And this allows us, of course, to hit our goals and our targets. And this is why goal setting is so important. It becomes invaluable in business. It's what we're focusing on as a team and individually. We want to remain focused on the outcomes, and those outcomes being positively stated. And that's the intention that we carry for the day. Shondale, so what we know is, you know, we have the ability to change our mind and the way we think, but why do you think these quick mindset shifts actually work? And is there an actual science behind them?
Yeah, it's such a great question, Alex. And I think that, you know, from that perspective, we can see great quick fix changes by the process of pattern interrupts, which we've talked about. But more importantly, I think that what we know about the brain is that people operate these programmings or this programming code that they've installed from the very first time that they did that behavior. And through the repetition of that, they actually, you know, create more solid programming. But what we can do is when we actually understand the code for the program, then we can actually make small changes really easily and effortlessly to the pathway of the program. And much like coding a computer software program, changing a little piece of code can change a completely different outcome. I think it's a little bit like that with our brain and our patterns. So it's like flipping a switch, and it changes the outcome that we perceive. And in many cases, because we're perceiving a different outcome, because we're looking at a different pattern or process, some of the things that were obstacles before are no longer obstacles as a result of that small shift. So I think a really big part of this is being able to make sure that you understand what's motivating the actual behavior and get clear on what's the process that you go through. And by doing that, sometimes even just the awareness of that is enough for people to actually make that change really quickly. And that can happen in seconds or in minutes. It doesn't have to take 10 years to undo something that you might have been doing for 10 years.
So from a neuroscience and success, often people say it's not what you think. So Shondell, tell me, a lot of people think success is just about working harder from a neuroscience perspective, but what's actually happening in the brain when people succeed?
Oh my gosh, there's so many things that we could talk about here in terms of neuroplasticity and the rewiring of the brain and cellular change in pathways, etc. And so I think, we won't take it that far today, but certainly, when we look at the process of change, I think we've got to debunk the myth that success is about efforting really hard. And it's not to say that you don't have to do anything and then things will change, but I think that we need to be thinking about what approach are we taking to change. So what do we believe about the ability to change? And that's really the mindset and the thinking behind that. And then how do we advocate for that and actually create new patterns and new behaviors? And sometimes that's as small as tiny little habits that we stack and that we include in part of what we're doing on a day-to-day basis. But then there's also, the concept of neuroconditioning and how we're actually rewiring our mental pathways. And a lot of the time this comes from beliefs that we may be holding or computer programming that we've got at a cellular level where we've always done something. And so we're just used to doing it that way. We don't actually step back often enough to go, well, for what purpose do I do it that way? And what if I did it this way? Would it make a really big difference? So it's actually a process of reflection and really making a decision to actually change something and then just making sure that the habits actually support that. But more importantly, that your beliefs actually support that new change. And so I think it's not just about working harder, because we could effort with the same beliefs and still, just be working much harder and produce the same crappy results. But if we actually change our belief, why it's important to us and, actually have an outcome for effort, then we can get really substantial results with much less effort. Alex, I know that sometimes we've had conversations about this as a group of coaches, and you've noticed that sometimes people feel really successful, but they didn't actually achieve their outcomes. And yet other times we've got people who hit their goals and they're doing absolutely fantastically well, but they still feel really off. You want to talk a little bit about what's going on there?
Yeah, absolutely. It's really, really fascinating how some people can feel really successful without hitting any major milestones, while others, they feel, despite their efforts, that, it's a little off, yeah, and that excitement, that joy is not there for them. So what's really going on is it's really tied to how the brain's dopamine and reward system works. So dopamine is often called the motivation molecule, and it's released when we expect a reward. But it's not just about the big milestone and the reward. It's also about the process, working towards something. So even if it's a reward, a small reward or a delayed reward, for example, when we make progress, no matter how tiny, the brain can release dopamine. So it makes us feel good, and that's the motivation and the drive and the kick that we get to keep going. However, the brain often confuses the effort with the results. So sometimes, even though we hit a goal, the satisfaction may not necessarily be there because our brain's more focused on the journey as such, than the actual outcome. So in short, when we're in flow, the brain is getting plenty of dopamine. But once we hit the goal, if the brain doesn't release the expected dopamine, we can feel a little bit flat, or, sometimes we feel a little surprised. We thought we would have been a little more excited about the outcome. And so generally we feel like something might be missing. Yeah. So this is the reason that when we have people in overwhelm, it's a really great idea to break things down. And even in terms of tasks, I know it's one of the things that we talk about a lot at Life Puzzle is, breaking tasks down when people are in overwhelm or stress. We break them down into 15-minute time slots, because we know when everybody achieves, or when most people achieve that 15-minute time slot, that is part of the journey. And that's when the dopamine release hits, because you're hitting the tick. Yeah, check, finished, completed. And that dopamine hit, that's where you get that shot. So that's where you feel good. It's a motivator and keeps us going. So we've found that to be really successful in terms of what it is that people can do to make sure that that dopamine hit is continually being released to keep people going and keep motivation going in the workspace. So, Brad, in discussing, whether it be dopamine release or whatever it is that we're discussing, neurologically speaking, in order to, get that success and motivate us and keep us going, how does NLP fit into this? Like, what techniques help people train the brains for real success?
Look, I think that the fundamental here is, and we all know this, is our brain is trained for the path of least resistance. And the more complicated we give things to do, the harder it gets to be and around that. So the concept around strategies and modeling really comes back down to breaking down what is the behavior, what is excellent. And anyone who's been in the industry for a long time will know of the story where the founders of NLP got hired by the US Marines to study and model the snipers and being able to get the best results. And the very, very short abridged version was they got the best sniper, had a 99.99% success rate or kill rate or accuracy, depending on who you're asking. And they wanted to break it down to sort of work out how they could do that. And what they did is breaking down all the behaviors, everything from what the guy had for breakfast, how he tied his shoes, how he set himself up, right through to what was the picture in his mind right before he squeezed the trigger, and going through that. And they're going to go through all this data, and they just broke it down in the fundamentals of what is the actual strategy, what are the fundamentals. Because, look, the fact of the matter is, what the guy that had at breakfast probably had some input onto it, but it wasn't going to be duplicatable for other people. So breaking those things down made all the difference. And as a result of that, they were able to have a fantastic result where they were able to really increase the overall average accuracy rate of those snipers with a significantly less amount of practice and ammunition, which led them to being able to show that this modeling process was actually could be duplicated and rolled out again and again to improve that. Now, that's the basis of all NLP. Comes back from modeling excellence and being able to be aware of that. However, our mental rehearsals, sometimes we go through and spend a lot of time, thinking about what we had for breakfast to get the result, as opposed to what is the actual activity we need to do, what's the actual fundamentals of the strategy and how we go through that. What's the picture in our mind of that success? And how do we make sure that we're building these patterns and going through and doing that? And I know that you get comfortable into a routine or comfortable within a behavior, and then obviously we talked about before, pattern interrupts and rewiring, that sort of stuff is great. But the fact of the matter is that the one thing that you can do, which is taking that whole concept of the sniper and excellence, is shifting your thinking and acting. I like the term act as if. I don't like the term fake it till you make it, because linguistically the internal representation, the picture in your head is that you are faking, you can't do it. Where if you act as if, the context of actually pretending that you can do this, you have to pretend that you can do it. You have to create the picture in your mind, and therefore that actually starts rewiring and you start focusing on that. So if you know someone who does an excellent behavior and you can pretend to be like them or act as if you're doing that, you're taking charge of your state, your physiology, your psychology, the internal pictures, the sounds, all those sort of things. You can bring that into that and you can go through and do that. Now, we know this works because we've got some fantastic actors who will go through and model someone who's a real person and act that person out and do a great job. They're acting as if they're that person. So this is a very, very simple way of looking at modeling of excellent behavior. Okay, what is someone who does something really, really well? How do they do that? And can I act as if I have that skill set to be able to not necessarily trick my unconscious mind, but condition into the modeling of what is excellence to do that? And as a result of that, hopefully you can go through and see how you can quickly improve your results and the outcomes that you get by focusing on what you want and breaking down that barrier of resistance by acting as if and modeling a behavior that is excellent. So how can NLP instantly improve your communication skills? Okay. And Alex, tell me, we've all had conversations where it's just clicked with someone. What's happened in the brain when you build this instant rapport using NLP? What's actually going on inside the brain?
I love that you've asked, Brad, because I love rapport. Yeah. And what we know is people that are like each other. Yeah. So we've all had that experience where naturally when we walk into a room, we can instantly be drawn to people that are actually like us. Yeah. So have you ever walked into an office or, you feel that you've got this natural gravitational pull towards somebody? Yeah. So we don't necessarily have to be consciously aware. It just is something that happens. And that's because 93% of communication is nonverbal. Only 7% is words. Yeah. So that connection is made at an unconscious level. So this actually happens because instant rapport happens when mirror neurons, which are special cells in our brains, help us mimic others' behavior, their emotions, and even their speech patterns, which is really interesting because you notice a lot of the time when people have been overseas, they start to pick up an accent. And that actually can happen, yeah, because it's a natural order to actually pick up and match and mirror. So in NLP, building rapport often involves techniques like mirroring. And so we're consciously aware that we're doing it. And this is where we subtly copy someone's postures and their gestures or their tonality. And we're matching their words and their emotional state. And when we do this, it activates these mirror neurons, which helps the people feel automatically understood and comfortable. And especially we're signaling from the brain, that we're both on the same wavelength. And of course, this is great because it leads into more open conversation and it leads to people trusting you. Yeah. So at the same time, the dopamine and the oxytocin, the brain's feel good chemicals, they're also released. So this reinforces once again the positive feelings, making us feel likely to want to connect further. This creates smooth, almost effortless flow in conversation because our brains are in sync and we feel a common sense of connection.
So, Brad, when we talk about NLP and the way that it can instantly improve communication and skills, I think that we know that there are some high pressure moments, particularly in a professional sense, where people might need to give some feedback or they need to speak up, having a tough conversation or, in a room where there might be peers. So peers that may be senior to them, etc. So what are some of the things that we talk about in NLP that can help people communicate more effectively with confidence in some of those situations?
Yeah. I think starting off with holding the end in mind, or holding the intention in mind. What is the outcome you actually want in that scenario? Now that's a little bit hard to think about in the moment. Okay, what's that about this question? I got to have this. Not that easy. All right. So one of the best things to do is always start with a conversation of setting up an agreement at the beginning of that conversation, which is big picture. So it might be along the line of, hey, I've got a point of view that might be a little bit challenging on what you're saying there. Is it okay if I have this conversation? Is it okay if I air this point of view? Is it okay if I call this out on this? Is it okay for me if I say something that might be a little bit off kilter to sort of get the conversation going, or something along those lines? And by pre-framing that process, it does set it up for you to be able to break down the barriers. It also allows you to start feeling comfortable because you've kind of not asked for permission, but you've pre-framed that you're going to be saying something a little bit difficult, a little bit off center, to be able to go through and do that. And when that takes place, it allows you to sort of, first of all, setting up that agreement. Therefore, there can't be a lot of resistance from it. The other important thing is being able to manage that state management. And again, that comes back down to thinking about that outcome that you want. We've all heard of the imposter syndrome and how that has an effect on people. And effectively, that what you're doing is you're thinking you're less than, or you're thinking you're not prepared for this, and therefore you're creating that result. So holding the outcome of what you want in that conversation and that meeting at the moment, pre-framing it, or reframing if you get feedback to the contrary, reframing that as far as, okay, that wasn't my intention to take this conversation down this path. let's just backtrack here and work out how we got here in that scenario. And that can make a big difference as far as your confidence to be able to call out on the behavior that maybe is not necessarily going that well, or a conversation. And the other important thing when it comes to being able to, in front of a group of people, the best technique to have is being able to manage that state. And not always possible, but whenever you are someone who's really struggling and you feel that leading up to asking the question or leading up to the presentation, you're finding that emotions taking up there, then it's a really great way of stopping that in its tracks. And simply take your eyes and just look up. And by looking up directly, you break that connection to the kinesthetic, the emotional drive. And while you're looking up, you've got a chance to sort of reframe yourself and your mind, your process, and start thinking about the outcome you want. And then you can sort of move into that environment. It just sort of breaks that building of that emotion to the point where you start hyperventilating and sweating from your nose.
Oh, dear. Excellent.
Sweating from the nose.
Sweating from the nose. I'm not sure that I've ever sweat from my nose.
I have.
Oh, you mean on top of the nose? I was imagining like it coming down out of the nostrils.
Too. So weird. We both thought that because it's so irrational to think that. We both thought.
Yeah, so instead of like beating of sweat on the nose like it normally happens, we both went to like gushing sweat out of the nose nostrils. Oh God,
oh my God,
it
it's
is
so
late.
Fun. Before I had a really itchy nose and I'm like, I don't want to itch my nose because if I itch my nose, they're all going to itch their nose. And then I had to do it. So I guess, Shondell, all of these things collectively together, when we think about the conversations that we have with people, during our coaching sessions, I know one of the biggest questions that we get asked, and one of the things that people are most nervous about, of course, is the difficult conversations that they have to have at work, and until people really have a framework and know how to approach it, it can be very overwhelming and daunting. So what do you think stops people from communicating well at work, and how can NLP help them get past those roadblocks?
Yeah, it's such a good question. And I think it's something that, not only is prevalent at work, but it also shows up in lots of people's lives in different contexts as well. And so I think the biggest thing that I see as the number one roadblock is the assumptions that we make about how those conversations are going to go. And so in NLP, we talk a lot about, what is subconscious made conscious ceases to exist. And I think the biggest thing that people need to get conscious of is how they can create a story of an outcome that they expect through assumption and mind reads before they've even attempted to actually ask a question or seek some clarity or analyze what's really going on. I actually just had a session today with someone not long before we came here to talk to each other. And it was, okay, so what do you think is going to happen? And there was a whole clear story around all of the scenarios about how that person would act and how they think and what the presuppositions would be and what was assumed. And, because I know that they're like this and I know that they're like that. And it's like, okay, so when was the last time that you actually had a conversation with that person? Did it go exactly like you expected? Oh, actually, now that I think about it, no, that person was really responsive and, just answered and I was so relieved. So I think the first thing is, the assumptions that we make often will become the stories that we tell ourselves. And that may not be such a bad thing if you actually end up going and having the conversation regardless. But for most people, the barrier is that assumption and the story they tell themselves happens only in their head. And it's enough to stop them from going and actually having the conversation. So I think first and foremost, we need to stop assumption. The next thing is to actually look internally and go, well, if I'm making some assumptions about what I think is going to happen or, whether or not I'm okay with having these conversations, it might very well be that it's your own itty bitty shitty committee or your own limiting ideas about yourself, whether that's your worth, how much you deserve it, whether or not you've done it before, your confidence level, whether you think you can or not, all of those things. And there could be many more. I'm just giving some examples there. Those beliefs that we have around our internal filters and, what we think our value might be can actually prevent us from asking for what we want. So that's another way that when we look at NLP, we often will say, where are you presently and where would you like to be in terms of where you desire to get to? So even sometimes just the process of making a list of where I am now and where I would like to be and then assessing what the gaps are for that, that's a great strategy for us to be able to get clear about our journey and how we bridge that gap. And then we can make a plan, of course. But then the last thing I think is really about transformational language, and the small shifts that we make in our language can be the success or the failure. So many people, and Brad's talked about it before, where he talks about the act as if frame. And, often people will say, fake it till you make it. The difference between how you feel from an integrity point of view, between fake it till you make it, which kind of feels icky and like I'm pretending and I'm trying to be something I'm not, versus I'm going to act as if I've got this, right? So what does that look like? And how can I step into that? That's so much more empowering than something that's fake and false. So even just small language shifts on how we describe things to ourselves and to other people can really change the way that we communicate with others, but more so, it changes how we communicate with ourselves. And the most important relationship that we have is the relationship between us and us. So you and you. Like, if that relationship and that communication has chinks in it, then it's probably going to be translated externally to the communication with others as well. So a lot of the time we have people come to us and talk to us about how sometimes the thoughts that they have about their ideas to be successful, or what they're capable of doing, who they are in their identity, etc., sometimes are what we call the itty bitty shitty committee, and that those things can often hold them back from what they need to do. So, we all have an inner voice that tells us whether we can't or whether we can. I guess I'm wondering, and I'm wanting to bring up for discussion, how do our beliefs actually shape our reality? Brad, what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that the funny thing about beliefs is they can happen at any moment in time, and then people kind of stick with them for the rest of their life. But funny thing about beliefs, it happened in that moment in time. It only took a few seconds for it to happen. Why does it have to take any longer for it to disappear or not happen? However, we effort at this process of refilling and iterating and following up on that belief on that we have, that ends up being then a focus. And therefore, once it becomes a focus, then we've got that, as we mentioned before, the RAS, your reticular activating system, starts going out there and finding evidence of where this belief is true. Okay. Yet in a moment, you can have a belief created, and you can also in a moment have a belief disappear. However, we back ourselves into this corner by looking at what we're actually doing and focusing on that. So again, realizing that these beliefs are based on the environment we're in that moment in time, and two people could be in exactly the same environment and have two different beliefs. So it's not true in that scenario. So being able to reframe your own thoughts around that and catching yourself is sort of thinking, okay, what are the beliefs I'm having? What am I saying here? Is this a limiting belief? Is it a positive belief? Going through that and bringing that to your awareness is a really great way of going through there and catching yourself through that belief. Again, I got this job, but someone else could have probably done it better. Maybe I'm not as good a leader as what I could be, or maybe I'm not a good parent as what I could be, or maybe I'm not, insert anything here. You then go through the process of fulfilling that belief. However, you go, okay, how did I choose to create that? And the question is, how did I choose to create this belief? And by asking yourself, how did I choose it, or when did I decide to have that belief, it causes you to stop and think and go back in your memory, back in your neurology, to the moment in time when you had that belief. And retrospectively, you probably haven't actually thought about how you created that belief. And in that moment in time, you can actually go back and think about how did you decide to have that belief, and that reflection can actually shift and change it, or bring into your awareness maybe what you were focusing on that you shouldn't have been, and that gives you a chance then to reframe and think about what is that belief that you're going to be having. I often laugh when people go, I've got this big problem, I've had it my entire life. I said, what happened? And, it was this moment in time. And it was like, I said, so what, 2 or 3 seconds, 2 or 3 years? Oh no, it was only 2 or 3 seconds and it took place. And you've had the belief the rest of your life. They're going, yeah. So if it only took 2 or 3 seconds to create it, why should it take any longer than that to get rid of it? But I've had it my entire life. I said, yeah, I get that. So challenging yourself, when did you decide to have that belief? When you decide that you had an addictive personality? When you decide that you are a poor communicator? When you decide that you couldn't be, insert thing here, and go back to that time, reflect on it, and just that process will cause you to think about the picture in your mind, and I can not guarantee, but it's going to give you a different perspective on that if you're willing to let go of that belief. If you want to hold on to it, go for it.
So, Shondell, thinking about, people's limiting behaviours and their beliefs within themselves and the way that people are constantly restricting themselves and restricting their capabilities, limiting themselves. If somebody realises that they've actually got a limiting belief, maybe something like, I'm not good with people or I'm not good enough, how can they start changing that type of behaviour straight away?
Yeah, it's such a good question. And I think there's a couple of things to focus on here. The first one is a really simple one, and that is that when people have limiting beliefs or they have beliefs about themselves that limit what they think they can do or what they think they can achieve, often they'll spend a lot of time focusing on all the things that they're not. And that process of focusing on all the things that they're not tends to make it that they actually see more of the things that validate that. And so one of the really key things is to actually get clear on, what would it be if it wasn't that? So I think what often will happen is when people identify that they've got a limitation, they start going into over analysis mode of why am I like this and why does this happen? And here's more evidence of the fact that that's true. And so that paralysis by over-analysis is what I often call it. And so they're paralyzing themselves further by looking for more analysis to justify the less than behavior that they've been experiencing and the less than results. And then of course, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy that they go, oh, well, that's just me and that's all I can do. And here's the evidence that that's all I'll ever be. Whereas if I think that sometimes instead of people focusing on what's missing, if they actually took the time to think about, well, what would actually make them good at that? So let's assume for a second that that might be true in this moment. It doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be true for the rest of your future. So even if there is a gap between what you've achieved and what you think you've been able to do to this date, it doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't a gap or a bridge that you can actually map across to be able to achieve something. So for example, when we have an obstacle, let's say that the post-it note is the obstacle and people only see the obstacle and then they continue to focus on that obstacle, and the process of focusing on that obstacle means that all they can see is a validation of that. Whereas if we take a step back for a second, we go, well, what's outside the obstacle? Like, for example, like if I looked at this post-it note, in isolation and I put it that way, then what could I see differently if I looked at it that way? Or what's outside of the post-it note instead of seeing just the post-it note? And so because most people are focusing on the thing that they've validated as their limitation, they never give themselves permission to actually look for anything else that may be there in terms of skills or attributes. And this is really, really important because that validates that belief. So often when we do some really simple change techniques utilizing NLP, we often will talk to people about the pictures that they have in their mind that validate those beliefs. And sometimes it's as simple. We've seen some transformational changes where people are like so convinced that the image that they have in their mind of being somebody who is not good enough to somebody who is totally confident and willing to achieve and able to achieve anything that they want, just by simply changing some of the qualities of a picture that they have in their mind, literally within minutes, maybe an intervention that might take 10 minutes or 20 minutes in total, you can have somebody transform their mindset and their identity just because of how they pictured their identity at a subconscious level. So I think when we think about this, we really need to be thinking about what do I want to be instead and what does that look like? And then how can I bridge the gap between what I think I am to where I want to be? And that's a really simple process.
So tell me, Alex, what's one small habit someone can start today to build a more empowering thoughts?
Well, nothing really means anything until we decide we actually give it a label, Brad. So that's the thing. The way we filter information and the way that we actually view things is based obviously on our past life experiences, but it's also based on our environment. And for example, when we think about something like stress and anxiety and worry and nervousness and panic, they generally all carry the same symptomology in our body. So the label that we give it or we choose to give it will determine how it actually affects our neurology. So our unconscious mind can't tell the difference between what's real and what's fantasy. So when we focus on what we want and we picture achieving success, we imagine, what does it feel like? What does it look like? And what does it sound like? And our central nervous system will actually take notice and it actually supports it. So creating pictures creates a memory. And this determines our focus, which determines our state in turn. So if we get into the habit of imagining things going well and actually focusing on what it is that we want, it's going to make a really big difference and a massive amount of impact to our psychology. Therefore, our physiology will change and our perception will change as well. And also in leadership, we've got to be mindful of the fact this will change our language and the way that we're communicating with our teams. So repeating positive thoughts helps rewire the brain. It creates new neural pathways that reinforce positive thought patterns and therefore behavior. And the more you say something and the more your brain says something, the more your brain is going to start to believe it. Yeah. So what we're doing is we're shifting our mindset and we're going from self-doubt to self-confidence. And once again, it's going to encourage the brain to focus on success for the day, and it will reinforce, empowering thoughts. And of course, as leaders, empowering thoughts and language within your team, it's going to foster growth, a growth mindset, and it's going to improve performance. And it's also going to affect the team's motivation to take on more challenges, driving more collaborative, success-driven environment.
So change your words, change your brain. Yeah. So what a concept. So we talk to ourselves all day long. I know some people more than others, self included. How much does these little phrases we use actually shape how we think and feel over time? What do you think about that, Chardell?
Oh, I just thinking and laughing about, all the conversations, I remember people used to say, you can talk to yourself all day long. It's when you answer yourself that you have to worry. But I think, many of us have so much in all seriousness, many of us have so much internal dialogue, and whether we're conscious of it or not, we're all talking to ourselves all of the time. And we're actually conducting instructions, if you like, between conscious brain and subconscious brain. And so the words that we use will actually shape how we think and how we act, because words actually carry a lot of energy behind them. I don't know if you've ever been in one of those situations where someone uses a particular word and maybe that word hit you and you had an exceptional amount of emotion as a result of that word being chosen as opposed to some other word. And so, believe it or not, the words that we use actually will impact not only how we feel, but also when we use them with other people, it will change the way that they react to us as well. So over time, as we condition ourselves through language, that's how we gauge our responses, both with ourselves and others. What often will happen is if we've got little kinks in the system, or perhaps maybe some negativity in the words that we're choosing or the way in which we're talking to ourselves, then what happens is we start to create, this barrier or this reinforcement to, those things being true and correct. And whether we're just repeating them to ourselves in a jovial way, or whether we're, really beating on ourselves with lots of negative emotions while we tell ourselves those things, the subconscious mind doesn't generally distinguish whether or not we meant it, or whether it was a joke, or whether it's true, or any of those things. So it just accepts uncritically all of those words, and then it chooses to make them a reality. And so when you think about that, if you've got really empowering patterns, like I know that there are people that sometimes walk around and they have a belief that they're really confident and that they're outspoken and that they can communicate well. And so because they believe those things and they tell themselves that, then generally their actions match that conversation that they're having with themselves. By the same contrast, I've also met people and have been a person in the past where I had very unwarranted and negative talk tracks about myself, my identity, my capability. And of course, those things became part of the reinforcement of that pattern for a long time, and then the self-fulfilling prophecies from those actions and those behaviors. And so when you start to actually get conscious of the lens that you put on yourself and you catch yourself using that negative dialogue with yourself, what you can do is you can reinforce language that's much more empowering. And, my mum Teresa used to have a thing where she'd say, I don't like saying just act as if or fake it till you make it, especially if I'm not there yet. And so she used to have a thing that she would talk about when she was in the process of obtaining skills. And so maybe try it today. It's something that perhaps maybe you don't think you're good at yet, and it doesn't feel right to do an affirmation to say, oh, I'm so confident, if you don't really believe you are. maybe what you could do is condition the pattern of the language to actually say, I'm in the process of becoming really confident in this area of expertise or this subject matter. And that way, what you're doing is you're building that neurology and small little wins that validate that for yourself, which then become part of the neurology, part of your identity, and then ultimately part of your unconscious behavior to how you think, feel, act, and behave.